Hello, my name is Nathan Shear, and this is A Voyage Long and Strange. I am here with my co-hosts Joseph Tremanis and Murphy Nasanchuk, and we will take you on a voyage long and strange through history in a not boring kind of way, but we make no promises. Alright, so why don't we get started? Today's show will be dedicated to our hometowns of the Northern Highlands School District. Murphy and I from Upper Saddle River, Joe is from Allendale. Specifically, we'll be discussing the impact of one of the most infamous conflicts of American history, the Vietnam War. So, the Vietnam touched all aspects of American life.
I agree.
Thank you. So, remnants of the war can be found in any American town, and the four towns of the Northern Highlands School District are no exception.
Oh, indeed. The war is memorialized in many ways, not solely in memorials themselves, but in things like newspapers and magazines from the 60s and 70s, as well as streets and buildings that are named after the fallen soldiers from the conflict.
Yeah, so the first subject that I think that we should talk about would be in what ways was the Vietnam War memorialized, or at least shown in print media.
Glad you asked, Nathan. It affected the high school as seen by the school newspaper, the Highland Fling. There are several articles mentioning the Vietnam War, the earliest of such printed in the March 1966 edition, where there was an article about the sentiments of Northern Highland students towards the war. Here's a quote from it. It said, "An overwhelming majority of students honestly believe that the war will not end shortly, that is, within the next year or so." Now this was in 1966.
All right.
It goes on to say most indicated an interest in supporting a school drive to send blood, or whatever else might be necessary, to our armed forces in Vietnam.
So there's support for the troops, but a dislike of the war.
Well, not necessarily, because the surveys that were cited in the Highland Fling said an overwhelming majority of students thought the war will not end shortly, not that there's a general dislike of the war.
Exactly. So the Highlands' view on the war was quite positive in 1966, which happens to be the height of the escalation period that President Lyndon B. Johnson started. There are several other findings that were brought into light. The most frequently recurring response to what the United States foreign policy should be towards Vietnam was negotiation followed by escalation and continuing the foreign policy as it is.
So, many Highland students thought that the continuing escalation was necessary.
Precisely.
At a time when more troops were in Vietnam than at any other time.
Indubitably. Now, the next one I found very interesting because it kind of shatters the image of young people during the time period. When asked if they had participated in peace marches and demonstrations, almost all Highland students said no. Then we were then asked if such demonstrations were effective, and the student body unanimously said no, that they were not effective.
Wow, that's surprising.
Yeah.
Because when most Americans think of this topic during this time period, many think that it was young people who were out marching, wearing the black armbands, the Fifth Avenue Peace Parade, the Students for a Democratic Society, stuff like that.
Exactly.
Well, that can be explained, Murphy. In the article, the last paragraph said that almost all Highland students had no friends or family that were drafted or re-enlisted.
Okay, so there it is.
Yeah, so because there were almost no ties whatsoever to the men going off to Vietnam in the school district, most students supported the war.
Yeah, I mean that's very common. It's very similar if you're friends with or have a person in your family who is, let's say, LGBT, and if that happens, then you are more likely to support LGBT rights.
Forsooth.
Yes.
So was there anything else that was found in the Highland Fling?
All the other articles were about current events. For instance, in the same March of 1966 edition, there was an article about numerous solutions from both sides of the aisle as to how to conduct the war effort. But, unsurprisingly, the author of the article tended to be more approving of the actions of the Johnson administration by listing the negative effects of pursuing any other path, such as putting forth terms of settlement towards the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese government.
All right. Well, so Murphy, you did a bit of research on print media outside of the school newspaper, the Highland Fling. What did you find in other Bergen County newspapers?
Okay, well, the Bergen County newspapers, such as the Bergen Record, reported on local events pertaining to Vietnam quite a lot. They vary from returning veterans sponsoring memorial gardens to announcements of the October 15 moratorium to the end of the war in Vietnam.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that. There was an article mentioning the Vietnam Moratorium Day on October 15th in the November 1969 edition of the Highland Fling. It said that discussions on Vietnam were encouraged in history and English classes, and it looked at Nixon unfavorably, saying he was unaffected by the protests across the country.
Also in the same article, wasn't there a quote by the vice president in that article?
Yes. Vice President Spiro Agnew called the peace protesters an effete corps of imprudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
Jeez.
Oh god, that's beyond harsh.
And the Fling commented on that, saying, "Let us hope that our leaders in Washington will in the future show more understanding of the issues they have created and now must solve."
But was there, Murphy? Back to what you were saying about newspapers other than the Highland Fling. Was there anything that involved the Northern Highlands District in these newspapers?
Well, those newspapers cover many towns in Bergen County, so there was very little news about the Northern Highlands School District towns specifically.
But there were articles about Bergen County in general. Like I know that there were announcements in 1969. About Bergen County veterans who were getting appointed to the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and there were also reports about the My Lai massacre. So were sentiments mainly positive, or were they negative towards the war in this area, according to newspapers?
Well, again, because there weren't many people in the Northern Highlands school community and the surrounding towns who had connections to veterans, there was much more support towards the war effort than in, let's say, large cities like New York, where selective service offices were commonplace.
Yeah. I mean, there was a newspaper printed by the Hackensack branch of the Bergen Record that reported on peace marches that picketed selective service offices in September of 1969.
Yeah.
Well, was there anything else?
Well, newspapers like the Bergen Record covered the whole of the county, therefore making it a less useful source than the Highland Fling, which focuses on the Northern Highland School District specifically.
So, all right. So we've talked about memorialization of the war through text, but what about actual memorials? Because isn't there a war memorial in Allendale?
Yes, I went there this weekend, actually. It's called Memorial Park. It lists the names of residents of Allendale who were soldiers that died in the First World War, the Second World War, and the conflict in Vietnam. Now, among the names of the Vietnam War veterans, one of the names was Rocco J. De Mercurio, who was a graduate of Northern Highlands Regional High School. He was 19 when he was killed in action, fresh out of high school, as many soldiers were at the time. Yeah, and he was commemorated by having a street in Allendale named after him and a plaque in the park. The street's name is De Mercurio Drive, and it runs parallel to the A&P Shopping Center.
Yeah. There are a lot of streets named after veterans. Many of the street signs have the gold star on them to signify that they're named after veterans that were killed in action.
And hundreds of people pass those signs when they're in their cars every day.
And on their commute as well, yes.
Indeed.
So, yes, I mean, but so is there anything that either of you would like to say? Because I don't really have anything.
As a concluding remark, I'd like to say this. While the Northern Highlands community wasn't actively involved in the war as other large towns because we didn't have many students actually going off to fight, we weren't separated from the conflict. We understood what was going on, but didn't have the same passion that other protesters, citizens, and students did at the time, hence why it may have seemed like it didn't affect our community. But, seeing as we lost Rocco J. De Mercurio, it is very clear that we still care about our foreign veterans in any sort of conflict.
Oh, yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah, I mirror Joseph's remarks.
Well, lovely.
Well, this has been a Voyage Long and Strange. I'm Joe Tremanis.
I'm Nathan Shear.
And I'm Murphy Nosanchuk, and I hope you've enjoyed this voyage with us. See you later.